Today we're tackling a huge question. India or China? Who takes the lead in Asia by 2050?
Yeah, it's a big one.
And we're not just speculating here. We've got insights from someone who really knows the region, a former diplomat, 20 years in the Indian Foreign Service.
That's right. So this isn't just headline chasing.
Exactly. Our mission today, to really get under the hood, understand the key factors shaping this future. We want to give you a much clearer picture, maybe even some surprising takes.
Definitely. And the diplomat we spoke to kicked things off with a really interesting analogy, didn't they?
They did.
Yeah.
Comparing China and India's strategic approaches.
Yeah, China was described as playing checkers with extra pieces.
Mm-hmm.
You know, methodical, powerful, but maybe a bit rigid.
Okay, checkers with extra pieces.
Yeah.
And India.
India was seen as playing three-dimensional chess, much more complex, maybe even appearing chaotic on the surface, but with this underlying depth.
Right, so 3D chess, implying more layers maybe?
Yeah.
What was the core difference you took from that? Speed versus something else?
I think it's about speed versus, let's say, strategic sustainability. China's moves can be incredibly fast, very decisive on the surface.
Like building infrastructure almost overnight.
Exactly. But the diplomat suggested India's approach, though slower, might be building something more resilient, more adaptable in the long run. It prioritizes that depth over the immediate, flashy move.
Interesting. Okay, so that connects to another phrase the diplomat used, China as a dragon with performance anxiety.
Yes, which sounds quite pointed, but it speaks to this massive scale and intimidation factor China has. No denying that.
Absolutely huge.
But then you look at the numbers, the projected growth. It's slowing, isn't it? Expected to be around 3.4% annually through 2050.
Which is still growth, but maybe not the breakneck pace we've seen.
Right, and this connects to the smoke machine analogy used for some Belt and Road projects. What did you make of that?
Well, it suggests that the perception of influence, the image projected, might be, well, bigger than the sustainable reality on the ground.
Like a PR exercise almost.
Potentially, in some cases. The diplomat mentioned concerns about debt distress for countries taking on these massive loans for BRI projects. Are these projects genuinely functional long-term or creating dependencies?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? Or trillion yuan, as the diplomat put it. Are they delivering real economic benefits or just looking impressive?
So not all that glitters is gold, perhaps. Which brings us to India's system.
Right, the whole idea of democracy as a secret superpower, which sounds counterintuitive given the debates and delays we often see.
Yeah, you think democracy, you often think slow processes.
Exactly. The highway example was stark. China, maybe 6 months. India, potentially 3 years for a similar stretch.
3 years versus 6 months, that's a big difference.
It is. But the argument was the Indian highway, built through consultation, land acquisition processes, debates, it might actually be more sustainable, better integrated in the long run.
So the process, while frustratingly slow sometimes, builds resilience.
That's the idea. And reaching a projected $42 trillion GDP by 2050 while maintaining those democratic institutions, the diplomat called that unprecedented.
Unprecedented. Why that word specifically?
Well, think about it. Economic superpowers have often risen under different systems. Doing it at that scale, within a functioning, noisy democracy, that's a different model, potentially more stable long-term.
So the slowness might be a feature, not just a bug, in terms of long-term stability.
Could be. And it challenges that idea that just building stuff fast equals dominance. China's infrastructure diplomacy is vast, but if it leads to debt traps or unsustainable projects...
then it's not really development, is it? It's creating leverage.
Perhaps. And India's approach, like the International Solar Alliance, seems more focused on partnership, right? Building with countries, not just in them.
It feels different, more collaborative, less transactional, like you said, partnership versus dependency.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now, shifting gears slightly, soft power.
Ah, yes. Bollywood came up.
It did. Called an underrated diplomatic tool. The idea that it builds these emotional connections.
Which ports and highways maybe don't do in the same way.
Exactly. It's about hearts and minds, creating a positive feeling, a familiarity. If people around the world are watching Indian films, listening to Indian music.
It creates a different kind of opening, doesn't it? A cultural resonance.
But as the diplomat stressed, you need both, right? Soft power needs that backing of hard power, economic strength. It can't just be movies and music.
No, you need substance behind the style. Which brings us back to those infrastructure projects, the trillion-yuan question about whether they actually work economically for the host countries.
Right. It's one thing to build a port, another for it to be profitable and integrated into the local economy sustainably.
If it just sits there, not generating the expected trade or jobs, well, that's a problem.
A very expensive problem. Now let's talk tech. India's IT sector.
Okay. The Diplomat didn't just say IT support. The phrase was digital martial arts.
Oh, I like that. What does that imply?
It implies something much more sophisticated than call centers. It's about building the actual digital infrastructure of the world.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, think about Indian engineers in Silicon Valley. They're not just maintaining systems, they're creating them. Then there's UPI, the digital payment system.
Which is being looked at or adopted globally now, right?
Exactly. And the space program.
Yeah.
Chandrayaan landing on the moon for less than the budget of some Hollywood movies. That's incredible cost effectiveness and high-level engineering.
That space example is really striking, which leads to another comparison. TikTok versus Chandrayaan.
Right. Short-term fad versus long-term capability.
Explain that.
Well, TikTok generates huge immediate buzz, massive user numbers. It's very visible, but it's ephemeral. Platforms come and go, governments can ban them.
Okay. And Chandrayaan.
A successful moon mission, even a cost-effective one, demonstrates deep scientific knowledge, engineering prowess, long-term strategic thinking. That capability doesn't disappear overnight. It signals something fundamental about a nation's potential.
So one is fleeting attention, the other is lasting influence and capability.
Precisely. And this idea of lasting capability ties into the challenges China might face, the authoritarian's dilemma.
Right. The idea that the top-down control that allowed for rapid decisions early on might actually hinder adaptation later.
How so?
Well, if power is too concentrated, if there isn't space for open debate or course correction from below, can the system adapt to unexpected shocks or fundamental shifts? Can it foster the kind of bottom-up innovation needed for the next stage of growth?
It raises questions about long-term flexibility, definitely, especially when you contrast it with India's foreign policy approach.
Which the Diplomat called multi-alignment, not just non-alignment.
What's the difference, really?
Non-alignment often implied standing apart, maybe being passive. Multi-alignment sounds much more active, engaging with everyone.
Like being in the Quad with the U.S., Japan, Australia.
And also BRICS with China, Russia.
And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Exactly. It's about actively pursuing India's interests across different groups, maintaining strategic autonomy, not being locked into one camp. It's playing that 3D chessboard, perhaps.
It seems much more dynamic than just sitting on the fence. Now, what about hard power? Military.
Okay. China's budget is obviously much, much bigger. No contest there on spending.
But the Diplomat argued spending isn't everything.
Right. Experience matters. India has decades of managing really complex border situations, counterinsurgency, diverse terrains.
Things China's modern military hasn't faced in the same way.
Potentially. It's that difference between impressive kit on paper and proven operational capability in messy, real-world scenarios. Strategic thinking honed by experience.
Right. And looking forward, the nature of conflict is changing too, right? Hybrid warfare?
Yeah, cyber, space, information. It's not just about tanks and planes anymore. And here, India's tech talent pool could be a significant advantage.
That digital martial arts capability again.
Exactly. Having the human capital that understands and can operate effectively in these new domains is crucial.
Okay, let's talk geography. The Indian Ocean.
Key strategic waterway. And the Diplomat had that great line.
China got invited to the Indian Ocean. We were born here.
Yeah. It underscores India's natural geographic advantage. It's India's neighborhood, fundamentally.
And alliances like the Quad bolster that presence, focusing on maritime security.
Definitely. It's about ensuring stability and open sea lanes in a critical region. Now, speaking of neighbors, China and Pakistan.
An uneasy alliance was the term used.
Well, the point was it seems primarily based on countering India rather than deep shared values. And it requires significant ongoing investment from China, particularly the CPEC project.
So it's maybe more transactional, less organic, and potentially fragile if circumstances change.
That's the implication. Alliances built purely on opposing a third party can be less stable than those built on positive shared interests.
Interesting. Okay, let's also touch on India's own defense posture. It's not just reactive anymore, is it?
No, there's a clear shift towards being more proactive. building up border infrastructure significantly, focusing on indigenous defense production.
Moving away from just responding to threats towards actively shaping the security environment.
That seems to be the direction. Building deterrence capabilities, though the diplomat also stressed that diplomacy always remains the primary tool.
Diplomacy first, but backed by credible strength. Makes sense. What about the idea of an India-China alliance? Ever feasible?
Highly unlikely, according to this perspective. The fundamental differences in worldview, governance, and strategic interests are just too vast.
Okay, and the Quad. More than just a tea party.
Definitely evolving into something more substantial. Increased military exercises, cooperation on maritime domain awareness.
Yeah.
It's gaining strategic weight.
How about nuclear doctrines? India's no first use versus China's posture.
India's policy is clear. NFU. China's is generally considered NFU too, but there's perhaps more ambiguity, or at least perceived ambiguity, which can affect regional stability calculations. Clarity versus ambiguity makes a difference.
And border management. We see ongoing talks between India and China.
Yes, dialogue continues, which is positive. But the underlying tensions and differing approaches to border resolution remain a major challenge. One side perceived as more aggressive, the other seeking resolution through talks, but also bolstering its defenses.
Okay, shifting back to the economy. That $42 trillion projection for India by 2050, is that just IT-driven?
Not entirely. While IT is huge, the projection implies broader growth manufacturing, services, domestic consumption. It's about a more diversified economic takeoff.
And China's economic future. Besides the slowing growth, any other potential headwinds mentioned?
The concentration of power under Xi Jinping was raised as a potential issue. Can one person, however capable, effectively manage such a complex economy without risking missteps? Does that structure stifle adaptability long-term?
An authoritarian's dilemma again.
Exactly. And there's the contrast in financial markets. The Diplomat highlighted investor trust in Mumbai's relatively transparent market versus Beijing's more controlled approach.
Market manipulation versus genuine price discovery.
Something like that. Where do global investors feel more secure in the long run? That's relevant.
But Western investment still flows into China, right? Despite diversification efforts.
Yes, absolutely. The China Plus One strategy is real companies are diversifying supply chains, and India is a major beneficiary. But China's market is too big to ignore completely. It's not an either for many businesses yet.
So China's achieved incredible things economically, that's undeniable.
No question. But the diplomat pointed to underlying concerns. Debt levels, demographic challenges, the difficult shift from investment-led to consumption-led growth. It's not all smooth sailing ahead. Real growth versus maybe some statistical PR at times.
Okay, let's talk about innovation. India is famous for jugaad.
Jugaad. Resourceful, frugal innovation, making things work under constraints.
Is that enough, though? Or do you need more structured planning?
The diplomat suggested a balance is needed. Jugaad is great for adaptability, but you also need institutional planning, like India's NETI Ayog looking towards 2047. It can't just be improvisation.
And manufacturing strategies. How do they differ?
China has been the master of volume manufacturing. India seems to be focusing more on moving up the value chain, technology-intensive, high-value manufacturing alongside volume.
Different niches, perhaps. What about the relationship between wealth and power in the two systems?
In China, significant wealth often seems intertwined with political alignment. In India, while there are debates about cronyism, the democratic process means economic decision-making, like major reforms, requires broader consensus. It's slower.
But potentially more stable and less tied to political whims.
That's the argument. Decisions might stick better because they've been debated and bought into more widely.
Okay, back to the Belt and Road. Seeing any strain there? Repayment issues.
Yes, reports are emerging of countries struggling with repayments. This narrative of debt-trap diplomacy, whether fully intended or not, is gaining traction and causing some pushback. It contrasts with India's partnership approach again.
How does this play out in places like Africa?
Different approaches again. China uses things like Confucius Institutes, massive infrastructure projects. India focuses more on capacity building, scholarships via ISRO, for example, education, leveraging shared developmental experiences, South-South cooperation.
Which might resonate differently.
Possibly. India's approach might feel less imposing, more like a partnership among equals facing similar challenges.
And India's soft power, described as a live concert.
Yeah, meaning authentic, maybe a bit chaotic, less polished or centrally directed than, say, China's state-sponsored cultural outreach.
Like Bollywood's organic global reach versus planned initiatives.
Exactly. Or the growing influence of Indian creatives in Hollywood. It's happening organically, not because of some government directive.
So should Bollywood stars be official diplomats?
Maybe unofficially.
Mm.
The Diplomat acknowledged their potential influence, but stressed the need for professional diplomacy, too. You can't just rely on celebrities.
True. And things like yoga. Exported voluntarily, not directed.
Right. It highlights the power of organic cultural adoption versus top-down promotion, which brings up censorship.
A big difference. China's tight control versus India as well.
Chaotic but largely free media environment. The Diplomat argued that censorship ultimately undermines credibility on the world stage. People trust open information more, even if it's messy.
Does India's relatable chaos resonate elsewhere?
The idea is that India's experience managing immense diversity and navigating democratic challenges is something many developing nations can identify with more than a highly ordered top-down system.
Okay, tech again. Colonizing the internet.
Contrasting roles. Indian engineers were crucial in building the internet's global infrastructure. China's focus has often been seen as controlling access within its borders, building versus controlling.
And food. Can't forget food diplomacy.
Apparently not. Creates powerful emotional connections. Hard to argue with a good curry.
True. What about peak panda diplomacy?
Just suggesting that state-directed soft power, like gifting pandas, might have limitations or feel less genuine than organic cultural influence.
Now, the U.S. factor. Crucial piece. Is the U.S.-India partnership just about countering China?
The Diplomat argued no, not solely. Shared democratic values are a huge part of it, alongside converging strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific. It's deeper than just being anti-China.
So a real alliance versus a seasonal one.
That was the implication. It's seen as a deepening long-term strategic partnership, not just a temporary alignment.
There was a prom analogy.
Yes. A lighthearted way to describe the U.S. weighing its strategic choices in Asia, suggesting India is increasingly seen as the more reliable, values-aligned long-term partner.
Washington's view of Delhi is shifting towards future partner.
That's the sense. Recognition of India's growing potential, its scale, and importantly, its democratic foundation.
And the idea of a life jacket scenario.
Simply that democratic partners are more likely to support each other in a major crisis, based on shared values.
India's role in the Indo-Pacific strategy. Is it just following the U.S. lead?
No, India has its own vision for the Indo-Pacific, focused on inclusive growth, open sea lanes, maritime security. It aligns with U.S. interests, but isn't solely driven by them.
So U.S. policy needs positive goals beyond just checking China.
Yes, and partnership with India offers that positive agenda cooperation on tech, climate, health, etc.
How does China threaten U.S. hegemony compared to India?
China challenges it directly through economic and military power. India's rise is seen differently potentially as an inspirational democratic model and alternative path rather than a direct systemic threat.
So India isn't just milking China fear for closer ties.
The argument is it's building relationships based on shared opportunities and values, not just leveraging fear. Though strategic convergence regarding China is undeniably a factor.
Could India gain more influence by sometimes ignoring the U.S., asserting more independence?
An interesting thought. Greater strategic autonomy, confidently charting its own course, could paradoxically enhance India's standing and influence over time.
Let's talk internal challenges. India's internal debates, strength or weakness.
Presented as a strength, actually. The democratic process, however messy, allows contradictions and tensions to be addressed openly, potentially leading to more sustainable solutions than suppression.
Whereas China's tight control, could that be a time bomb?
That's the risk highlighted. Suppressed dissent doesn't disappear, it can build pressure internally. Democracies have release valves. Authoritarian systems might lack them.
So democratic resolution versus suppression to avoid collapse.
That's the contrast drawn. How do you manage internal pressures long term?
What about nationalism? Helping or hurting diplomacy?
Can be both, right. Constructive nationalism can unite a country, but excessive or jingoistic nationalism can complicate foreign relations. It's about how it's channeled.
And censorship again.
Yeah.
Decentralized chaos versus top-down control.
India's chaotic media landscape, while having its own problems, allows for a degree of self-correction over time. Top-down control risks creating an echo chamber detached from reality.
Religious tension in India, a major challenge.
Absolutely acknowledged as a challenge. But the argument is that democratic institutions, however imperfectly, provide mechanisms for managing this diversity, unlike systems that might try to impose uniformity.
Bureaucracy. Still slow.
Still seen as slow, yes, but undergoing reforms. And the Diplomat made the point that sometimes slowness prevents really bad, hasty decisions, a potential silver lining.
Freedom of expression, differing views.
Clearly, fundamental differences in societal and governmental views on this between the two countries.
And public trust. How is it maintained?
In democracies, trust has to be constantly earned through accountability, elections, free press. In more controlled systems, it might be asserted or demanded more than earned.
Media control, short-term messaging versus long-term credibility.
Exactly. Controlled media can push a message effectively short-term, but a free press, despite its flaws, builds more long-term credibility and acts as an early warning system for problems.
Okay, future tech. The AI arms race.
The contrast drawn was India's focus on human-centric AI, using it for development, versus potential concerns about China's use for surveillance and control. Different philosophies.
Democratizing space. India's cost-effective approach.
Yes, ISRO has fundamentally changed the economics of space access, making it more accessible for smaller nations, too.
Is China just reverse engineering or genuinely innovating now?
Acknowledge that China has moved significantly beyond simple reverse engineering into genuine innovation in many areas. But India's open ecosystem might foster a different kind of innovation, perhaps more disruptive in some fields.
Tech future. Human capital over hardware.
The argument is India's strength in software and its growing hardware capabilities, combined with its vast human talent pool, is a massive long-term asset.
Data use. Development versus weaponization.
Contrasting how data is leveraged, India aiming for development goals like health, finance, versus potential weaponization for control or influence.
Cyber warfare capability.
India has significant potential here, given its tech base. The key is strategic thinking and responsible development of these capabilities.
The Indian startups, real disruptors or just Western clones?
Increasingly seen as real disruptors, solving uniquely Indian problems at scale, which often have global relevance, moving beyond just imitating Western models.
Can India survive without China's chips? Semiconductor strategy.
Diversification and building domestic capabilities are key parts of the strategy. Reducing critical dependencies is a major focus, like for many countries now.
Lunar colonization. Efficiency versus being first.
ISRO's focus seems more on sustainable, cost-effective exploration, perhaps enabling broader participation, rather than a space race focused solely on planting flags first.
Quantum computing. Cooperation or a new Cold War.
The hope expressed was for cooperation, given the profound implications of the technology, but the potential for competition is obviously there.
Okay, let's look at global perceptions. Southeast Asia. Trust versus fear.
The general sense is that Southeast Asian nations prefer partnership without domination. India is often seen as a less threatening major power compared to China. Trust is a key factor.
Europe's view? A quiet bet on India.
Increasingly seen as a stable, reliable, democratic partner in Asia. Less noise than the U.S. partnership, but growing substance.
Russia's role. Mediator or ally?
Complex. Russia maintains ties with both. Historically strong with India, increasingly aligned strategically with China, it plays a balancing act.
Africa. Partnership versus battleground.
India emphasizes partnership, capacity building, South-South cooperation, trying to offer an alternative to the perception of Africa as just a resource battleground for major powers.
And global perceptions generally.
Yeah.
India liked, China respected, but maybe feared.
Something like that. India often enjoys more favorable public opinion globally. But respect, trust, and perceived value are maybe more important than just being liked.
Can China recover its image post-COVID and with current policies?
Challenges remain. Issues like transparency, assertiveness in the South China Sea, treatment of Uyghurs, these continue to affect global perceptions beyond just the pandemic handling.
So is India seen as a future leader or still just a noisy democracy?
The perception is shifting towards India as a responsible, rising power, a potential leader, though the noisy democracy aspect is still part of its identity.
BRICS. Diverse dinner party or a real counterweight to the West?
More like a diverse dinner party with some shared grievances, perhaps. The internal contradictions and differing interests within BRICS make it difficult to act as a truly unified counterweight.
Leadership styles. Feared versus respected.
The Diplomat suggested true leadership relies on predictability, adherence to principles, and effectiveness, which builds respect rather than just relying on fear or coercion.
So the narrative is peaked China, waking India. Is that too simple?
It's a simplification, but it captures the current perceived trajectories. China facing headwinds, India seen as having huge potential yet to be fully realized.
Peaceful rise, China's old term, versus peaceful cooperation, India's approach.
Subtle but important difference in emphasis. Cooperation implies partnership. Rise can sometimes imply displacing others.
Why might China focus on dominance over friendship with neighbors?
Complex reasons, perhaps, historical perspectives, perceived security needs, the nature of the political system prioritizing control.
India's goal, global leader or just like to the UN?
Aiming for principled leadership, being a constructive voice, Vishwaguru or world teacher is a concept sometimes mentioned, not just seeking popularity votes.
What about passive-aggressive diplomacy?
Acknowledged as a tactic used by various countries, subtle ways of expressing displeasure or exerting influence without open confrontation.
Nationalism, used for elections in India, used for control in China.
Different roles. In democracies, it's often mobilized for electoral purposes. In authoritarian systems, it can be a tool for ensuring regime loyalty and unity, sometimes fueled by censorship.
India saying no at summits. Does that hurt relationships?
Demonstrates an ability to defend its own interests firmly, even against partners. It can cause friction short-term, but also signals strategic autonomy, which can earn respect.
Belt and Road, becoming a road to nowhere for some.
The sustainability concerns, debt issues, and sometimes questionable economic viability of certain BRI projects feed this narrative.
Is India too polite for power politics?
The argument was that politeness, or rather a non-coercive diplomatic style, can actually be a strategic advantage in building trust and long-term partnerships.
Lecturing versus listening in diplomacy.
Effective diplomacy requires listening. India's experience managing internal diversity necessitates constant negotiation and listening, which could be an asset internationally.
Insecure leader, proud follower, psychological dynamics.
Just touching on how leadership styles, assertive, dominant versus collaborative listening, can affect how other countries perceive and interact with a major power.
Okay, fast forward to 2050, a hypothetical UN speech. Who sounds more convincing as a global leader? Dragon or tiger?
Based on the projected $42 trillion economy, stable democracy, growing technological prowess, and cultural influence, the diplomat clearly saw India positioned very strongly for a global leadership role.
Does Asia even want a single leader?
Probably not. A multipolar Asia with several major powers cooperating and competing seems more likely and perhaps more stable.
Future made in Shenzhen or Bengaluru?
Oversimplified, but captures the contrast. China's incredible manufacturing efficiency versus India's strength in software innovation and problem solving. Both will be crucial.
Can India achieve dominance without conquering? Influence through attraction?
That seems to be India's preferred path, shaping global norms and attracting partners through its values, culture, and economic opportunities, rather than through coercion.
Is sustainable leadership possible without democracy long-term?
The diplomat implicitly questioned this, suggesting that adaptability and legitimacy derived from democratic processes are vital for long-haul sustainability.
Can India afford to wait for its rise?
The rise seems underway, but the pace matters. The argument is for accelerating reforms and realizing potential faster, not just waiting passively.
Could ASEAN collectively lead Asia?
ASEAN plays a crucial role in regional architecture, but perhaps lacks the scale and unified power projection of India or China to be the single dominant leader. Collective leadership is key, though.
Climate change, could that decide the winner?
Absolutely. The country that leads in sustainable technologies and climate adaptation will have a huge advantage. India's push on solar, for example, is significant here.
In a crisis, who blinks first? Strategic patience.
India's democratic system, while slow, might allow for greater strategic patience compared to a system where a leader might feel pressure to act decisively, perhaps rashly.
So maybe dominance isn't the right word. Maybe it's about influence. And who has already won in terms of positive influence?
That's a fantastic point. If dominance means making other countries better off, fostering shared progress, building trust, maybe the metrics need rethinking.
And in that framing, India's cooperative, democratic, partnership-based approach might look very appealing long-term.
It certainly presents a compelling alternative vision for how a major power engages with the world.
This has been incredibly insightful. Lots to think about beyond just the numbers. The nature of power itself seems to be evolving.
Absolutely. The diplomat's perspective really emphasizes that governance, values, and the quality of growth and partnerships might be the deciding factors by 2050.
So the final question for you, the listener, to ponder: What kind of influence truly shapes the world more profoundly? Is it the kind that builds dependencies or the kind that fosters shared progress?
A great question to leave things on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
And thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, keep diving deeper.